Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today I was reading up on Pennsylvania politics in the 19th century and came across a passage about the individual pictured here. He is Thaddeus Stevens, the esteemed member of the U.S. House of Representatives during the Civil War period. He was a statesman. He was an abolitionist. He was the person who wrote some of the great laws of our country that we follow today. And his passage appears in a 1902 memoir by Alexander McClure, a newspaper editor who lived in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. His house was burned in 1864 by Confederates. Stevens and McClure were friends. They knew each other, and McClure jotted down some thoughts about Stevens. This was in these 1902 memoirs, and that was fascinating because I learned something, a new word, or at least new to me, a term that is, I'm quite sure, antiquated by today's standards, a political term, commoner. The idea of a commoner, politically speaking, is an ordinary citizen of humble origins who came to wield tremendous power and influence in the government and used it for the good of the country, not for him or herself. This is Thaddeus Stevens, and according to McClure, he deserved that title. McClure, in a passage I'm going to read to you shortly, compares Stevens to the only other man in the 19th century that McClure thought deserved the title of commoner or great commoner, and that is Henry Clay. So, without further ado, let me get to this passage where McClure talks about Thaddeus Stevens. Here we go. Thaddeus Stevens, McClure says, was the commoner of our Civil War. In the entire history of the Republic, but two men rose to the distinction of commoner, Henry Clay and Thaddeus Stevens. Clay was the accepted commoner while he led the cause of the country in the popular branch of Congress during the War of 1812, and Stevens ruled as commoner during our entire Civil War. The title of commoner is not generally understood in all its grand significance. Such a distinction is possible only in times of great national peril, when the conflicts of ambition are compelled to yield to the public safety, and no one can wear the crown of commoner who does not win for himself the undisputed leadership in directing legislation for the cause of the Republic when threatened by civil or foreign war. Presidents, cabinet officers, senators, representatives, and diplomats may win position by fortuitous circumstance, and often without possessing the ability necessary to fill it credibly, but the commoner must completely equipped in ability, courage, and skill to lead the cause of the government and command respect and unquestioned following. Clay was the grandest of American commoners. He was able, eloquent, and fearless in disputation and imperious in action. He differed from Stevens in his wonderful magnetic qualities, which attached men to his personality and aided him greatly in his supreme command of forces, while Stevens lacked the personal charm of Clay and was always self-poised and ruled in grim and relentless mastery. Even Clay, with all his genial qualities and beloved personality, had vastly greater dispute with the supporters of the government during the War of 1812 than ever confronted Stevens during our civil struggle, but both have left a record of unbroken leadership as commoners. While Stevens's record during the war fills such a prominent part of the history of that great conflict and has made his name familiar with all students of the great epics of the Republic, there is no one of our great men whose general characteristics are so widely misunderstood. He was indifferent to criticism and to public misconception of his acts and purposes. Unlike Clay, he never sought to popularize himself. On the contrary, he greatly hindered his political advancement in the early part of his career by his heroic devotion to the cause of justice for the helpless and lowly. When the war came, Stevens refused any compromise with the rebels. In one of his speeches discussing the proposition of compromise, Stevens said, quote, "Rather than show repentance for the election of Mr. Lincoln with all its consequences, I would see this government crumbled into 1,000 atoms. If I cannot be a free man, let me cease to exist." End quote. Stevens was the natural leader who assumed his place by common consent. He surprised many who regarded him as wayward and fitful in leadership by his uniformly conservative and consistent action in supporting the government, and on all questions relating to secession and all questions growing out of the war. Stevens ever stood squarely and manfully for the supremacy of law. Many believe that he was one of the desperate abolitionists whose aims and purposes could best be described by the quotation, "Damn the Constitution." But in every issue between law and the expediency or law and necessity, Stevens loomed up as the most conscientious and masterly exponent of the law and earnestly urged obedience to it. He was the early advocate of engaging the slaves as soldiers and for the abolition of slavery and the enfranchisement of the freedmen. He carried through the House a bill at an early day abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, and later a bill to give the right of suffrage to the Negroes of Washington, regardless of any standard of intelligence or property. He was also the author of the 14th Amendment, reported to the House on the 30th of April, 1866. In his last great speech in defense of the rights of the Negro, he evidently felt that he was nearing the end of his great life. He said that there was nothing in his public course relating to human freedom that he could wish to have expunged or changed. And he added, quote, "I believe that we must all account hereafter for deeds done in the body, and that political deed will be among those accounts. I desire to take to the bar of that final settlement the record for which I shall this day make on the great question of human rights." End quote. So there you have Thaddeus Stevens talking about the 14th Amendment, and in context, the larger body of work of Stevens as, according to Alexander McClure, the great commoner of our Civil War, right up there on the heights of the great commoner Henry Clay from the War of 1812. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research